Hi, gang. I'm going to continue our adventure through the book of Exodus as we follow the children of Israel as they were brought out of their captivity, and the Lord delivering them to the promised land. And what a great adventure! And you can imagine what these people experienced as they went through this. And so, as we begin in chapter 20 today, we kind of glance back and remember that they just received the Ten Commandments from Moses, and right after that, we see that the Lord said, Moses tells them that the Lord has done this, and they were just showing their fear of the Lord and all this that was going on, and he said he does this so that the fear of God will keep you from sinning. The fear of God would keep them from sinning, that they would recognize what God required of them, and what righteousness looked like, what holiness looked like. And of course, all of this begins to start pointing towards the Lord Jesus Christ. In verse 22 of chapter 20, he begins to speak to them about building an altar and how they were to worship. And so we begin to see the application of those main 10 ideas as one, how to approach God, how to deal with God as men, but also then how to deal with your fellow man. So there was the idea of our vertical relationship and a horizontal relationship with our community, and then also with the Lord himself. And so we pick that up in chapter 21. And right from the beginning, it says, these are the laws you are to set before them. He gives Moses these laws. And this is the application of these concepts, these ideas that are presented as the Ten Commandments. And so how would they, how would they play out in their daily life? What would this look like in the application of these things? If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the seventh year he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man would go free. These passages around servants, and they begin to call them slaves, and it's a drastically different understanding than sort of our cultural concept of slavery. And in many of these, the fact that a person could be a Hebrew servant was the idea that they agreed to serve someone. It was actually like an employment contract. It was to pay off a debt that they had, to be able to go to work for someone, to have their provisions and their basic needs met while they worked and provided a service for someone else. But the idea was that they could never own them for the rest of their life. They couldn't drag out this payment that you will be in bondage for me for the remainder of your days, and because your debt was so large, but that every debt would be canceled and in the seventh year. And so created this 7-year cycles where for 6 years you would serve someone, but in the seventh year you were allowed then to go free. And so there was, it kept from abusing that employment, that heart to repay a debt. But it actually was another side, that it made that person that was loaning someone cautious, and they had to have wisdom about who they loaned money to. And so there was two sides to that they couldn't just be frivolous about money, because the best they were going to get was a 6-year payback in service from someone in repaying that debt. and so there was always that thought process, and that should create wisdom in those decisions on both parties. And so if they went into a household as a servant, that if that servant came along, he would go home, go free alone. But if he has a wife, when he comes, and she would go with him when he left. But if the master provided a wife and he took this woman as a wife, that woman and the children actually were under the master's care, and that if he left, he actually left them there. It was kind of surprising because it feels like it's a breakup of a family. But I think the idea, and I think we see this as we go, was more of the idea that if that person is brought into that household in service, and he was to give a daughter or could be another servant that is under his care, that he wouldn't automatically give that wife and children to her, because they may have been in a similar type of setting or contract. And so it puts a thought process into when this marriage was going to happen. What was this going to look like, and what was going to happen 6 years down the road, 7 years or beyond that, to a family. And so there had to be wisdom in those decisions. If we go on, it probably adds just a little bit more understanding to this. Verse 5, but if the servant declares that I love my master and my wife and my children, and I don't want to go free, I don't want to leave my wife and my children behind, that there was a freedom offered. And so the idea to stay was a free choice, and to stay with the children, to stay with a wife, to declare a bond to that household, that they had the freedom to do that. And then if he did not want to go free, then verse 6, his master must take him before the judges, and he shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. So it was declare that a bondservant, that my life is bonded to that house, to take that person before the judges and say, this man has declared to be bonded to my house. And so this many times is done too, that you would take a bondservant would bond to the house. It was like a family member, that this person had lived with them for so long. They were just like another family member. And if there was not a son within the household for the inheritance, that many times this bondservant would become the primary person for the inheritance. And particularly in later days, we see that. But the idea was that person became bonded to that home, and they become like family to them. And the idea of going to the doorposts and driving an awl was to say this person is attached to this house. And it's very literal, this person was nailed to that house. And then there was the idea that they probably, with that hole in the ear, put some sort of an earring or something in there that was their declaration that they were a bondservant to that person, to that house. And so verse 6, then if the master takes him before the judges, make this declaration, drives the awl through his ear of the doorpost, that he would become his servant for life. Let me scroll this up a little bit. Verse 7, if a man sells his daughter as a servant, which sounds so, in our culture and all that's going on, that just sounds so crazy. But let's go on, and I think it'll make sense. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do. So he's providing protection. Obviously, there were probably abuses in a situation like this, and there had to be great care. God is putting boundaries around these things that were already happening in a culture. He isn't just saying, it's okay for you to go do these things, but he's saying these things that are already happening in the culture, he's putting boundaries around and protections around there to limit the abuses. And so he's taking care of these daughters. So a man sells his daughter as a servant. The idea was that she was becoming a maid servant to a family. And again, this was a blessing to a woman that had no other provision in her life, no way to provide for her. The father had no way, for this to provide her for another family. That he had no son, and he had no inheritance, but that there was a debt that had to be repaid. That she could become this maidservant to repay that debt, to have her needs met for life. But there's also the idea that she was coming into this household as a maidservant that in time might become a wife to someone within that household. And so it wasn't just a father selling his daughter into slavery. And so we shouldn't look at it like that, but it was really a blessing for him. It was a blessing for her to have this opportunity. And so if a man sold his daughter as a servant, she was not to go free at the end of 7 years. He couldn't just say, you're out of here. If she does not please the master who selected her for himself, kind of sounds like selecting her for marriage, that he brought her into the household in preparation for a marriage, but it didn't work out, changed the mind, that if she didn't please him who selected her, he must let her be redeemed. He has to go back to the father and allow the father to redeem her, that he couldn't just outright put her out. And he has no right to sell her to foreigners. And again, the idea, you can imagine the abuses, that foreigners that are operating in a different mindset, a different economy of ideas, rather than the boundaries that the Lord has put up to protect women, that the foreigners would not abide by those. So he had no right to sell this daughter of Israel into the hands of foreigners, because there would be no escape for her, and it would be rife with abuses. And so he had no right to do that, because he had broken faith with her. And if he selects her for his son, he says, well, I do want her to be the wife of my son, then if he must grant her all the rights of a daughter, and she no longer is treated as a bondslave or maidservant, but she becomes a full-blown with all the rights of a daughter. Verse 10, if he marries another woman, he must not deprive her of her food. So if the son, he brings her to marry another woman, this maidservant's in the household, he couldn't just cut her off and say, sorry, it didn't work out, you're out of here. But that her basic needs must be met, that she would have food and clothing, and that she would be restored to her father, or in the culture have full marital rights to marry someone else. And so if he does not provide her with these three things, then she would go free without any payment, without any money, that her debt would be canceled, and because he has failed at the contract. So they would know this going into taking this maidservant, that there were boundaries set up to protect her from abuse, to allow her to be free from that debt, to be available to be married again if this didn't work out in this household. So I think we see a lot of the protections there that are the focus of this, not the idea of bondage or slavery or anything, but it was opportunity. Remember, you're dealing with a culture that had no social programs. There wasn't unemployment. There wasn't anybody going to jump in and defend you. You didn't have lawyers ready to go sue somebody because of you didn't get treated fairly or whatever. But they're setting up this understanding within their culture, within their community, so that these men, Moses being the first, but these men that sat under Moses as judges, these elders that would sit and judge for Israel and take these laws and apply them in justice and in a manner that the Lord would be glorified as He designed for His people to do. So I think we're going to see some more of that in the next chapter too. Also, let's move on. Verse 12. Then anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. However, if it is not done intentionally, but God lets it happen, they are flee to a place I will designate. This is going to be cities of refuge that He will name later as He brings them into the promised land, the cities, ideas of cities of refuge. And so He says He will name these places, designate these places. But verse 14, if anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death. It's the idea of that person that has killed someone, has thrown themselves on the altar, has at the mercy of God, knowing their own guilt and confessing their guilt, but that person would be taken from the altar and they would be executed because of their sin. It is the law of retaliation that to take a death is to offer your life. You not only took that person's life, but you not only stole that person's life, but you stole the life of all of their offspring. And this is a person created in the image of God, and you have destroyed the life that God gave. And so this is looked at very, very, very strictly. We look at it, and many times, regardless of your feelings of where you're at on the death penalty and things like that, you look at this and you see they had no prisons. They didn't carry a caravan of prisoners around from place to place. That everything within the community rules was almost looked at as like a pass-fail, as that if they failed in these things, that there was such a serious offense. And we look at those things and we go, well, it doesn't seem that serious. It doesn't seem like that big of a deal to us. And in many cases, and of course, we think it's not a big deal as long as it's not us. When it becomes us, then it's a big deal. When it affects our family, it is most definitely a big deal. So this is God looking at His family and given the boundaries of how these things are to be looked at. And it basically says accidents are going to happen if anyone who strikes a person's fatal blow is death, but if it's unintentional, they're going to have a place to flee. And this is going to give them completely off the hook, but their life has changed, even going to a city of refuge, which we talk about when we get there, but they weren't completely let off the hook. So there had to be great care, great stewardship when dealing with another person, and great compassion and respect for human life. Verse 15: if anyone who attacks their father and mother is to be put to death. You look at that and you go, I don't see a lot of exceptions there. If anyone who attacks their father and mother is to be put to death, this goes right back to the commandment to honor your father and mother, and with that is the promise of long life. And so that is the ultimate in dishonoring your father and mother, is to attack them, and to attack them obviously you have missed the blessing for long life by honoring them, and that your life would be taken from you because of that. I could just imagine how, just that one line right there, just imagine how different life would be in our world if fathers and mothers were respectful to their children, honored the family, and that children in turn honored their mother and father and revered them and respected them with the authority as their elders, and we just look back and we see how that is just slipped down a notch every time we turn around over the last 50, 100 years or whatever. That respect for parents has waned, and so he is establishing for them the importance of that relationship. Anyone, verse 16, who kidnaps someone is to be put to death. To kidnap them is to take them from their life setting, to steal from them their context of life, to remove them from that. If you kidnap someone, that you're to be put to death, whether the victim was sold or is still in the kidnappers, was still found in the kidnapper's possession. Did not matter. You've removed them from their life setting, from their context of their life. And so that is to sacrifice your life for theirs, the law of retaliation. Verse 17, anyone who curses their father and mother is to be put to death. Another verse, interesting that we see these two verses separated by the one of kidnapping. It's kind of interesting the way that it's set up there. And so anyone who curses their father and mother, it again is disrespect for your father and mother, and just how that cursing, that disrespect in that way would bring the penalty of death. And again, we look at that and we go, wow, that is just serious business. And so this idea was cursing was a dishonoring, but it could be as much as a physical attack. Kind of built in that idea of cursing could be as dishonoring them, but also a physical attack. So if people quarrel and one person hits another with a stone or with their fist, and that victim does not die but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held liable if the other can get up and walk around outside with a staff. However, the guilty party must pay the injured person for any lost time and see that the victim is completely healed. What an amazing way to control. But if you better be careful if you're going to strike someone, because by what God set up in that community is you strike that person and you hurt them, because if you strike them, you struck them for one reason, and that is to hurt them and to inflict pain. And again, to bring wisdom, is like, you better think about if you're going to inflict that person with pain, because if you do, you get to nurse them back to health, and you get to pay their wages while they're lying in bed healing during that time. And so you better think long and hard before you react and do this thing. You better be slow to anger. And so in these concepts, we see many of the New Testament things that were spoken in a different way. And the disciples, the life of the disciples in discipleship and walking with Christ, we see those things existed even back in the when the law was given to these people. So if there was a quarrel and you hit someone and you strike them, that you have to see that person healed up. Verse 20, anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Man, again, this is a difficult passage because culturally it's hard for us to grasp this, to understand. First of all, beating a slave with a rod is a punishment inflicted on the slave. Why was this person punishing this servant? And so you get the picture of maybe of a wicked servant, a servant that needs to be punished. And so if you give the benefit of the doubt and say, this is a master that is punishing a wicked slave, but if the slave dies, a result of that, they're to be punished. So in punishing even a wicked slave, a horrible slave that deserves to be punished, there had to be great care and great respect for the life of that servant. So giving that master the benefit of the doubt of this person that was under their employment, that had bonded themselves and say, I will work off my debt, but that is a wicked, it's a lazy slave, someone that stole from them, or whatever the case may be, that punish was brought in, but there still had to be respect for the life of that slave. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers. And again, the assumption that it was a just punishment for a deserved wickedness of that slave. And so if that is the case, then after a day or two, that slave would recover, that servant would come back and be fully recovered and return to employment and to their responsibility. And so you see a lot of accountability and responsibility, respect for life and the life of another in this. And all of these concepts we see being, massaged and taking this responsibility from people in our culture to where people just shy from responsibility. Nothing is their fault. It's always something else, someone else's fault, some outside influence, and so nobody is at fault, and we have really in our culture removed so much of that accountability and responsibility, and I don't think that's biblical by any stretch of the imagination, and I think that's part of why it's hard for us to understand a passage like that. So if people lost my place. So I'm going to go back to 18 and read that. If people quarrel, one person hits another with a stone or their fist, and the victim does not die but is confined to bed. Oh, I read that. That's where he's going to be completely healed. Anyone beats their male or female slave with a rod, it must be punished unless the slave recovers. Verse 22 then, going on. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman, now there's two lives involved, which is just fascinating because we see this in our own culture, that on one hand we call that baby something other than a life or a baby in our culture, but yet if someone kills a woman that has a baby, it becomes a double homicide, and they've taken two lives. It's fascinating how we can change the definition of what that child is, whether it's a life based on our own personal convenience. For men, it has a wickedness all of its own. People are fighting to hit a pregnant woman, and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury. The offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands. Buddy, I'm telling you, this is what this says is you better be careful that you never hit a pregnant woman, because you are absolutely at the mercy of that woman's husband, that he can name the price of whatever the courts allow. And so out of compassion and of what kind of person would do this to hit a pregnant woman, and that the husband would get to name the price and the court would allow it, and you have put yourself at the mercy of someone. So again, you better be slow to anger. You better think through before you act out that hatred in your heart, and which is again points right to the things that Jesus spoke to us. Verse 23, but if there is a serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and a bruise for a bruise. And so, again, it's so that law of retaliation that if there was a serious injury that came to that child from hitting that pregnant woman, and that, or even to the pregnant woman, it appears that there would be a retaliation of like manner, whatever the what was inflicted to them. I'm on verse 26. I want to look at my notes. So, one little note on this is, you go, if the life of that child was important in the eyes of God, that there was a law of retaliation in effect, that if a life of that child, or that child was hurt and damaged in any way, that there was a life expected for that child. You go, where does that leave a nation that aborts millions and millions and millions of babies? An entire, generation of people have been killed. You look at, you look at these past elections, and they're talking, 70, 80 million voters or something like that. We have aborted that many children in this nation. And that would completely change the look of this nation. It's really crazy to consider and to think about, and to ponder it. Just even we are so good in our culture to look away from this and to ignore it, but to ponder what we have done is really shows how wicked it is that we struggle coming up with the words. I struggle thinking and trying to come up with the words to speak about this. And the other wickedness about this is that there were so many young women that were led to this decision that are carrying around this tremendous burden of shame and of guilt. And it's a shame and guilt that God can forgive. And where so many of them feel like they are unforgiven and they can't forgive themselves, that and so that's really comes to mind in this law of retaliation. There is a price to be paid, but there also is forgiveness and cleansing from that shame and that sin that is available, and we need to remember that. I don't think that changes the judgment that's due on this nation, but I think that can alleviate that from the individual, that they can be forgiven, and we should remember that. An owner, verse 26, an owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. Debts paid, slave goes free. Again, the owner, the master, the one that was carrying the debt, receiving from this slave the compensation by their work, has just lost their investment. And so again, there better be wisdom in dealing with those people that you're responsible for. And so there was to be great care by these by a master. There was great responsibility, great care, and there was to be wisdom by them, but also great care and wisdom by the one that was in bondage and in paying off a debt to that person, and really had a responsibility to pay that off. An owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. And which is kind of interesting, because it's like eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, foot for foot. But and then comes right back and says, you don't get to knock the tooth out of the master and get to keep the slave, but you've sacrificed that by knocking the tooth out, that you have now lost your investment in that slave, and that's what that retaliation looks like. That law. If a bull gores a man or woman to death, and so we go from people treating people this way, we talk about animals. So if a bull gores a man or woman to death, the bull is to be stoned to death. And so that bull has taken the life of someone created in the image of God. And so again, we see God's image on a person, and every person is precious in his sight, and that if this bull gores a person to death, that bull is to be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten. That nobody would benefit from this bull goring someone. A bull was expensive. It was like, for them, it was like their tractor. It was their farm implement. And that if this bull did this damage and hurt someone, that they couldn't just take this bull and go ahead and use it for food and have some gain from this, that bull must be put to death and not be eaten. But the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. So it was an accident. The bull gored someone. It's seen as an accident, understood it as an accident, but nobody is going to benefit from this accident by taking the meat. Verse 29, then if, however, the bull has had the habit of goring and the owner has been warned, but he's not kept his bull penned up, and he knows that this bull is acting like this, and the owner hasn't kept his bull penned up, and it kills a man or woman, the bull is to be stoned, and the owner also to be put to death. And so the owner now, because he knew that this bull was dangerous, he knew that he could take a human life, but he placed more value on that bull and allowed that bull to go free, and to the point of threatening another human being, that now that owner has to pay. And so not only the bull is killed, but the owner is also to be put to death. You better take care of your bull, is what that says. You better take care of your animals and make sure that you're not threatening another human life. And so it became a very important thing. However, let's scroll up a little bit. Verse 30, however, if payment is demanded, the owner may redeem his life by payment of whatever is demanded. So a life is due as payment for this, but there could be a redemption process that if that payment is due, the owner may redeem his life by the payment of whatever is demanded. It was essentially selling his life was already been sacrificed, and it was essentially trying to buy that back if a payment was demanded. So rather than see that person die, that they could say that person is going to give me compensation of this much money. How much money do you value to place on a life, but does killing another human that didn't specifically take part in that, is that justice? And so there's a allowance there for this redemption process. This law also applies if the bull gores a son or daughter. If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull must be stoned to death. So again, the bull died, but it's interesting because there's a different price set if a male or female slave. So a bull gores a son and daughter, there was one set of set value, but if that was a male or female slave, there was a different way of viewing that, because the son or daughter's life was already in bond to that slave, and in a sense there was an ownership of that person's life as they sold themselves into that bondage. So it's a difficult understanding. There's There's no doubt about it, because you see, all life is precious to God, but yet He places what appears to be a different value on these two. If anyone uncovers a pit, verse 33, or digs one and fails to cover it, and an ox or donkey falls into it, the one who opened the pit must pay the owner for the loss, take the dead animal in exchange. That makes sense. That seems very logical. It's a law of restitution. If anyone's bull injures someone else's bull and it dies, the two parties are to sell the live one and divide both the money and the dead animal equally. So each got half a dead animal and half of a live animal. And so there was a division of that. However, if it was known that the bull had the habit of goring, if the owner did not keep it penned up, the owner must pay animal for animal and take the dead animal in exchange. And so there was a swap. Congratulations, you bought yourself a dead animal, and I get your live animal. And so that is the way the restitution would work when the responsibility fell solely to that person who should have known that was going to happen. So we see these laws that are sort of, if the Ten Commandments were the bones, this becomes the flesh on the bones, the application of the law in a life, and it becomes the answer to what does this look like when we go through life every day. And so this looks like the Lord building accountability and responsibilities in people's life, that you are accountable not just to take care of yourself, but you're to take care of your neighbors, of your slaves, of your family, of those people in the community. You're to consider them. And so there was a responsibility within the community for every person. It wasn't every man for themselves, but it was every man for the community, and caring for the community under the watchful eye of God, with set penalties in place. And so it made a person responsible. It made them cautious. It made them wise. It would make them slow to anger, and always knowing that the Lord had established these things. Man, we could learn so much from this. In our culture, when we see our cities being burned, when we see riots in the street, and we look at and you study this, and when you see all this other stuff going on the news, you say, how far we have fallen, that we accept those things as being an okay display of anger, and there's no thought process that you're destroying other people's lives, livelihoods, property, and in so many cases there is little or no idea of restitution or retaliation in our due process, without in many cases probably nothing at all. But when there is, it seems to be so minor and so politicized in these days, and so there is no. The idea of justice is treated so much differently than what we see justice and righteousness played out in the Old Testament here. So that is chapter 21. And so again, I hope it helps bring the Bible to life. But you see these people, you see these situations, and you see why God is putting these things in place. And through that we can see how we can learn from that, and we just see that each of these sort of point towards the concepts that are given to us in the New Testament. So again, I hope that helps you bring the Bible to life. Thanks for joining me for Exodus 21. 22's coming your way as the adventure continues. Thanks for joining me. Hit the subscribe, like if you liked it, and thank you.